Hello everyone, Leaf Reed here, and today you can see I'm in the right setting to talk about a current topic, which is Dark Souls. The phrase that I think encapsulates Dark Souls is memento mori, old Latin phrase which means remembering death. It's been used in a lot of different media, from 999 to I think the actual movie Memento with Bruce Willis. And it's something that, upon remembering death, I think the idea is it's supposed to infer that there's something you've forgotten about yourself, or the purpose of living is found in remembering that one day you will die. And I think it's very open up to interpretation, but I think it's interesting in the Dark Souls universe. It is basically preambled with the fact that you have this sigil and this sign in which then, and there's a curse upon the land in which you can no longer die. And it's really interesting because, of course, the first piece of media and property that I was going to talk about that was related to this was Berserk. But as I thought more and more about the themes and symbology, it seems like Dark Souls actually takes more from the Bible and religion more than anything. So, this world in which people can't die, they're cursed to be attacked by demons and spirits and other kinds of things. And it's actually reminded me a lot, actually, of Revelation, in which it's said in those days, and it describes things like locusts with human faces and giant, like horns and things all over them that are pestering the people who weren't taken up into heaven in the final days. It's interesting that they said specifically, it always stuck with me, is that people shall wish to die in those days, but they will not, and that is the curse. And it reminded me of, also back to Final Fantasy XIV, this whole idea of the ancients, where if you're immortal and you don't have anything limiting your abilities or time or anything, then the sense of finitude is lost, and thusly the sense of purpose is lost. And so, Dark Souls is this key dark fantasy world in which there is no meaning, because life no longer has meaning. No one can die, and therefore in a state where no one can die, it's almost like the meaning of life is lost at a higher sense. And it also made me think about and realize certain other aspects of this universe, that, at the end of the game, you're confronted with a choice whether or not you're going to keep the flame lit or you deplete it. And the first option, which frankly I had no idea what was going on, I just left the bonfire after beating Gwen, thinking that I could just go back and get my materials, but it immediately triggered the bad ending, and I was like, can I go back? And it's like, no, New Game Plus, too bad. And that really it ticked me off, I guess. But you have that scenario where you just embrace the darkness, and in the other scenario you sacrifice yourself to the bonfire to keep the world kind of going and breathe new life into it. And it's really interesting because in the lore at the beginning of the game it says, the world is created at a dark into light, or heat and cold. And it's so interesting that, again, it's a stretch maybe to say it's a little bit like Genesis, but it says, the world was divided, this is how things were created. And then it talks about, the four great lords, from Nito to Seath, and, we can't forget that furtive pygmy, and Gwyn, I think, was the other great lord, who basically destroyed all the dragons, who were these mythological creatures. And again, maybe you could stretch that to reflect the Gregorian, the Watchers, who descended in Genesis, who were the fallen angels who created the Nephilim. And so it's more like these great lords are kind of like the Nephilim in that sense. But I think really what really drove home the biblical aspect is what is so interesting that I think maybe people don't quite latch on to, because there's a lot of different lore and a lot of different characters and moving pieces, but it really rests on the furtive pygmy. And if I'm recalling this correctly, he essentially is this very low-level being, and essentially he finds, the last piece of the great soul, and basically he's the progenitor of humanity. And it's so interesting that the true nature of the human soul is actually different from the other souls of light, in that the human soul is actually the dark soul. And that really got me. It really got me thinking that the true nature of humanity and these creatures that now cannot die and are marked with this symbol, similar to, the mark of the beast. The mark of the beast is either on the hand or on the forehead. And this one, they kind of just did a full berserk thing where it's on the back of your neck. But it's interesting that I really thought of, why would the soul of humanity be this black thing? Why would it be this inherently negative thing? And I thought, what's similar to that? What's similar where the inherent nature of something is kind of corrupted? And I realized that's very similar to the aspect of sin. This idea that we were born with this negative aspect within us, and it's only through some kind of sacrifice by some great being that we are able to alleviate it from ourselves. And so even though, Dark Souls obviously has this pantheistic outlook on it, the main character, Gwyn, is a Zeus or Christ-like character who sacrifices himself for the light to continue shining in the world and heal the corruption within humanity's souls. And when I made that connection, I just thought, of all the other literature I thought I was going to bring up, it's actually extremely biblical, more so than just ripping from Berserk. On an aesthetic level, it is Berserk the video game in my opinion. But it hit me like that. But the other thing I wanted to mention is also just an aside. It's so interesting the way they do the Dark Souls lore, and people have rightly criticized it because it's so overly simplified, but it's overly simplified in a way where it gives you all these little clues that leads you to conclusions. And Dark Souls is also known for its environmental storytelling, which is, again, all these little pieces and clues that leads you to a conclusion without outright telling you things. And that also translates into the philosophy of the gameplay. Here's this giant Taurus demon. You have no idea what, it's this huge thing, it's awful, it's horrifying, it's like David and Goliath. And you just realize, oh wait, if I just climb up this tower that it's right beside and I jump on its head, I do like almost half of its life bar is gone. And it's just through experimentation and the understanding and reading of the environment and the characteristics that you actually begin to understand the world of Dark Souls. And that translates exactly into the lore, where, you'll have someone like Seath the Scaleless, where he was like the one dragon who didn't have any scales and betrayed his kind. And that's it. More egregious is probably Nito. He is a giant skeletal dude, a skeletal lord, and that's it. I kind of love that. There is no backstory. He's just Mr. Skeleton who casts his diseases and curses. And it leads the player to give enough information about something, but not enough to really get a definite thing about it. And so the player's interpolation, both in the gameplay and the lore, moves in that direction through our own creative interpretation, which is just really cool. I love that. And that was a thing that was very common during the graphical styles of the 6th and 5th generation, where you had these weird pixels that were 64-ish bits, and you could say, oh, that's kind of like a person, but this is what they are in my mind. It's just different from what it's actually represented. And so what it really reminds me of is the Bronze Age collapse, which was roughly, I think, 1000 BC. And you had, this story about the sea people who appeared out of nowhere and invaded, Egypt, Sumer, Babylon, etc. And along with a bunch of other consequences, they weren't the sole consequence, but as one factor, these sea people appeared and invaded, and everything just collapsed after that, the earthquakes and whatever. But the thing is, that part of history, because it was a collapse, because we know so little about this, just how Plato only knows, the only reason we know about Atlantis is because Plato referenced this guy called Sidon, who is 10 generations before him, who references, oh yeah, Atlantis existed, then it was destroyed. The civilization off the coast of the Atlantic, near Europe and Africa somewhere, And it was this great civilization, and now it's gone, and that's all we know about it. And it's so interesting that the less we know about something, and the more interpretation we can give to it, and the more it is shaped in our own minds. And Dark Souls just does this with everything. So on one hand, people are very correct to criticize like lore masters in Dark Souls, at least when the game first came out, where they're like, yeah, no, this is stupid. This guy is from like Astoria, and we know like 3 things about it, and you're like reading way too much into it. You sound like a crazed schizo or something. But at the same time, it is fun to think about these things. Well, what is Astoria? What is it like? You just get a gist of it, essentially. And I did like that there. Certain characters in the lore of the game, essentially, they kind of all acted the same. Like Oswald of Karim and also Lautrec of Karim were both these very interesting sardonic characters. And I love that they kind of were not exactly the same, but they had this similar quality, the kind of voice and personality. And I just love how that little like line, and Sigmire of Katarina, or I can't remember the exact name, but I love the fact that he's this goofball. Like, he's completely different, and it's because you can tell he's from this distinct place. These totally made up places that you get a total idea of them just from these short, weird interactions between the characters. And because the interactions between characters is so rare, when they are very distinct and weird and kind of earthboundish, you get a very distinct idea of what that culture is like, which I think is really smart and really cool. On that point, I think my favorite character is actually Lautrec, and it's so infuriatingly interesting that the only thing you get to know about this guy is like his maybe a paragraph of dialogue that he actually speaks during battle and after he dies and when he's in jail, and then you get his armor pieces that give you stats away, but also tells a story about the goddess the goddess Fiona, and I think it's Fiona, and so, or Flora, and so the armor has this weird arms around it built into it. And it says that the arms represent the embrace of the goddess for those who have been forsaken. And this guy who was like a sadistic, evil guy who you free from the jail kills the Firekeeper, which is massively huge, because the Firekeeper acts as a huge mechanic to extend your life in the game. In a game like Dark Souls, you need a lot of life and a lot of Estus. And when you release him, he ends up killing her. You track him down and you take revenge and you kill him. But then you get the description of his armor. And it's this tragic story about this guy who basically was hopeless, and his only hope was praying to this goddess. And I guess you kind of interpret, or my interpretation, that he became obsessed and madly in love with the Firekeeper, and because she rejected him or didn't accept his advantage or something, he, out of his deranged jealousy and his extreme hope, he murdered her. And suddenly this one note character becomes very complex. And again, we can't know that because I'm adding my interpretive layer to it. I don't know if that's definite or defined, but that is what I am seeing in it. And for me, at least, he's the most interesting character, and I just love his voice in general as well. Guys. Hello. Have some friends joining us. They're just nibbling. They're having a good time. So it's interesting how it just gives you these pieces and you kind of follow them to their natural conclusions. And again, I think the whole aspect of reclaiming, the whole aspect of death following into gameplay, where the fact that you can reclaim your points in your souls one time, essentially after you die, if you can get to the same exact place, is literally memento mori, because you literally have to remember how you died, where you died, what killed you, and prepare for it. Because it's kind of like, I think everyone's experienced that, where they've lost like 1 million souls or something, where they just got too arrogant. They were grinding for like 6 hours and they just ended up slipping off something, screwing up in Blighttown. My big loss, my big gamble was in Blighttown, where I lost everything. And it was kind of one of those moments where I just almost didn't believe it happened, because I had killed the enemies leading up to that point like 60 times in a row with no problem. And suddenly, on that final try, I couldn't get back to it. I didn't level up. because you use your points to level up and makes things easier. And I was so crestfallen. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, but I was just like in disbelief. And I was like, I'm just gonna go to bed. But I have definitely had the moments of a little rage while playing this game, for sure. And again, it's the whole risk reward. I've never played a game where you really risk losing essentially your experience and your progress. It feels very, very difficult to go through the whole thing, and it feels very difficult to do it. But as long as it's the whole aspect of the game what I think is really cool, that as long as you have hope and determination, you can overcome death. And overcoming death is, again, a huge biblical theme. So Dark Souls, to me, I guess, is way more biblical than I thought or anticipated before I made this video. But that's kind of where it led me. And, in overcoming death and in overcoming the obstacles and these impossible bosses by just trying again and again and again, we get that reward and that, that dopamine, where we get part of that story and that lore and that atmosphere. And I guess on that point, I really like Dark Souls atmosphere, and I think it's such a specific thing, because when you have to do a traditional, like, dark fantasy adventure game, which has been done, whatever, and you're doing it in a very kind of not banal, but like a generic manner, like literally you have a skeleton dude, you have a knight dude, you have all these tropes essentially, and a bunch of stuff just stolen from Berserk. It's so basic that you have to do it in a revolutionary way. You have to do it super right or different than everyone else. And Dark Souls pulled that off. And so when I got into Dark Souls 2 and 3, I'd only played them for like a few hours because the vibe was just different. It was like, this is a sequel to another dark fantasy game. And as much as I enjoy the gameplay and overcoming challenges, I was like, why am I going forward in this? Why am I exploring this world where, Dark Souls, what I also love about it is how deeply connected the world is. You go through the catacombs, you find this thing, and it leads all the way back to the beginning, and you're like, oh, that's so smart. There's a secret passageway, and it links over here, and this goes over here. And I love connecting the world, because as you explore and connect the world, you also connect the lore and the stories of all the people there. And again, through the environments, it's telling the story of the game as well. And again, I just feel like it's so impressive what Dark Souls did, just in an aesthetic way. You have all the tropes. You have dragons, again, you have knights in armor, but they made them different, or made them act differently, where they were super, super tough and super intimidating. And to overcome them, it was not just, a power fantasy, it was a dark fantasy. It was really, really hard. I also think it's super interesting that, again, despite the Dark Soul being a dark soul, it's the essence of humanity. And when you first get a piece, and what I love about this is when you get one of those pieces, they don't call it a dark soul, they call it humanity. And humanity is a different thing, or at least they say it's a different thing, because souls are kind of the way that you increase your abilities and your persona and your powers, essentially, strength and speed and whatever. But the Dark Soul works as a form of humanity. And humanity, it is basically this thing where if you die once, then you've lost your humanity and you become this like kind of ghoul-like creature that's all like drained. And in order to retain your flesh and your form, despite the fact you can't die, you essentially need to use a piece of humanity at a bonfire, which is these mystical fire-like things. They're not technically fires, but they're fire-like in existence, and you use that humanity to restore your flesh and your being. And so it's this dark soul, this dark thing that is actually the essence of your being, that actually gives you life. And the themes of darkness and light and fire and cold are just really interesting, how they're intertwined. And from the very beginning, from the whole Genesis lore of how the world was divided into different elements of heat and cold and light and dark, those themes are through and pulled through the entire rest of the game. They're not just like, okay, well, here's some, there was a goddess and then she died. It's like, no, those ideas are the core ideas. If there was a storyboard for Dark Souls, those words of cold, dark, fire, and whatever would be on their board, essentially. They're the core ideas that are so compounded and moved over and fleshed out, that it's really impressive how they connected everything. The other aspect that I also really enjoy about the series, that again goes back to Umineko and Final Fantasy and all the really great stuff I've read, is that even though the people in this universe, they can't die, they can go hollow. And it's a fate technically worse than death, I guess their version of hell technically, but basically what happens is when you can't die, you lose, I guess, meaning. And so those who go hollow, you'll find certain NPCs that are friendly at first, but they turn hostile later. And so the implication is they've died so many times that they've lost their hope, they've lost their sense of being, and they become hostile. And so you find these ghouls and these skeletons in the beginning area, and you realize that's what you turn into if you just keep dying over and over again and you feel it's hopeless. And so again, I love how the theme and the gameplay complement each other, because Dark Souls is I would say it's a difficult game, but it's not exactly a hard game. I would say it's an unfair game, where it's kind of like, honestly, every From Software melee game is just, this is impossible until you learn how to parry. Like, every enemy has like this one weird weakness that just makes it like, oh, okay, this is easy now, and you're no longer getting your stuff kicked in. A hard game is something like Ninja Gaiden, where like no matter if you're targeting the enemy's weak spot, there's still a bastard to deal with. So, and I think that's also what I love about Dark Souls, is that if you just persist and just use your brain, or you talk to someone, you realize, oh, wait a second, if you just do this one weird thing, or this one weird weakness, if you use fire arrows or something, you can overcome this giant dragon boss. And so, again, it's not a power fantasy. You are this weak little person, and you're trying to find a way to get through this. And what I love about this is that, at least from a gamer's perspective, like usually when I play games, I'm playing it on their terms. Like, okay, you want me to parry, you want me to do this, I'll follow the rules. And then, but there's always a point where if there's a boss that is just way too hard and way too difficult and way too stupidly time wasting, I'm going to find a way to cheat, or as they say, cheese that boss. And I have no remorse, because at a certain point when my patience runs out, if a boss has killed me at least 10 times, I'm going to find a way to cheat at that point, when it's so just ridiculous that I'm not getting better, or I'm getting marginally better. I'm going to find a way to exploit it. And so, if I can find a way to shoot the guy through a crack in the wall before he spawns and bring him down to almost 0 health, I'm going to do that. And again, that's the gameplay and the concept of Dark Souls, that if you retain hope, if you retain a self-perception to not go hollow, to not give up on the gameplay or on the world of Lordran or wherever you are, you can overcome and have the reward and the ascension to the finale, essentially, that you can overcome the challenges. And I just love that is in the lore, the story, and the gameplay itself. They totally complement it. What I also love too is that one of the main ways that people do use a handicap in this series is that through the soapstone. And what I love about this like early concept is, again, it also is thematically congruent with Dark Souls, and that if you're having a really hard time in a boss, there's certain areas that once you get the soapstone from Solaire, you're able to summon other players to assist you in fighting other bosses. And so it's this really cool thing, because again, Dark Souls as it stands, from an aesthetic value, there's no music except in boss battles. There are very few NPCs, and when they do talk, it's all weird jargon and they don't have much to say. And most of the world is dead, it's empty, it's filled with hopelessness. And so the very fact you get to talk to another person is so rewarding. But again, they take that rare essence of light and humanity, and they apply that to a multiplayer setting where you can summon a random person who has no there are some incentives to like helping people, where they can just spawn in and help you take on this thing, and you don't know if that person has tried 5 times on that boss or 50 times on that boss. You don't know if they're sighing in relief, thanking you, or you don't know if they're breaking down in tears thanking you. That ability and that online action it was such a genius idea, because again, it's the only thing that people have, in a world full of hopelessness, is other human beings, and they are the things that give us meaning. Sometimes if you have a meaningless life, or you feel life is meaningless, at least you have friends or family or whatever, or maybe you have a pet. And it's so interesting that a lot of people do use their relationships as some form of coping mechanism, or at least at the very basic thing, every relationship gives you a sense of purpose, because you think, if I was gone, how would that affect that person? And in that aspect, the whole idea of common brotherhood and humanity, and the idea of universal brotherhood or universal harmony that is preached in a lot of religions is core and front and center, even in Dark Souls, in its multiplayer aspect. Again, I think it's kind of funny thinking about how I said the lore is overly simplified, and that's kind of a good and bad thing. And then I also recall that there's entire YouTube channels committed just to analyzing Dark Souls or From Software lore, which is really funny. But yeah, I didn't really get into the other Dark Souls. Dark Souls 2, I just didn't like the vibe. You start in a swamp, and I did get to Majula, and I have to say Majula is the best home base area in the entire series. It's beautiful. I love it. The atmosphere, the music, everything about it is great. The rest of the world, I don't care about at all. Dark Souls 3 is kind of like a direct sequel to Dark Souls 1, kind of finishing off the lore and adding stuff about Lordran, but I just didn't care. And I feel that has to do again with the level design. I feel like every spot in the original Dark Souls had a purpose. It had like, this is like this for some reason. And in 3, it was like, there's just, I guess, more stuff. It was like kind of nifty, but to go through a game like Dark Souls that's super difficult and super frustrating, I need a reason, either in story and lore and narrative. And while Dark Souls doesn't seem to give that up front, it's hidden in the subtext of the whole game, and it just doesn't tell you until you literally read an item description of like a used apron, and it says, oh, this was the story of this tragic hero that relates to this other character who is, and you find it in the shop, and that means that, oh, that person killed that person because of a lover's quarrel, and you're like, oh. So that's the Dark Souls experience, basically. And so if I feel that isn't there, I just like, well, this is just me torturing myself. Not torturing myself, but like just doing really hard boss battles, which is like, whatever. I might get into them later, but I remember I played Dark Souls, the original, in like 2015, so this was like 5 years after it came out, and I came into it with the mentality like, oh, this is just a really hard game that people won't shut up about, like what's actually going on here. And I was pleasantly surprised, like, oh no, this game is actually really solid. It actually has a narrative, a theme, a movement to it, if you will. It has a little spice. It's its own thing. And while it is super slow and super frustrating, it delivers something unique and genuine, something of the soul, I feel. And that, to me, is just, that's everything. If you can have an experience that you actually remember and retain and gives you purpose and meaning, then that is by definition important. And again, the whole purpose of Dark Souls is finding the light in the darkness. It's finding hope in the hopelessness, and it's saving the world through self-sacrifice. And that's the game. But yeah, I guess that's all I have to really say about it. I even surprised myself with this interpretation. I didn't expect it to take a turn like this, but that is why people do like Dark Souls. It's not just a hard game. There are actually very interesting themes and motives in it, and yeah, I'm really interested to see what FromSoft makes next. I definitely want to cover Bloodborne, because that's a whole different story. But yeah, I think for now that is good, and I will see you all later.